On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we answer your mailbag questions such as, when will we see Jesper Volstead in Minnesota?
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we answer your mailbag questions. We'll talk about Danila Yurov and what that means for the Wild's center depth if he does indeed stay at the center position. We'll also talk about Jesper Volstead's ETA to the NHL level and how the Wild can continue to try to build their roster and push themselves towards Stanley Cup contention after the Parise and Suter contracts stop becoming anchors. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021 and your daily Minnesota Wild insider. And just wanted to circle back to the mailbag episode that we put out last week. At the end of last week, I was just thinking to myself, we haven't done a mailbag episode in forever. So it made sense to just throw it out there and see what sorts of questions we got. And we got some great questions. Try to do those more frequently as I get accustomed to and settled into the new routine and continue to kind of build back up to where we were at with Locked On Wild. So appreciate everybody who submitted questions. Jay, I will answer your question here probably next week, just still kind of ironing out some things behind the scenes. Connor, don't worry, we'll get to yours as well. I'm going to talk about that with Alex on Monday's episode. And we will also be taking a look at a few of the other questions that come into play as well. But just wanted to hit on the three big ones for today's episode. We're going to start with Benjo. If Yurov is a true 1C, do you think we trade Rossi or have him play 3C? Thought he looked really good between 17 and 38. Brings speed and skill to the bottom six. So this has been an interesting discussion topic over the last few weeks because Michael Russo continues to point to the fact that he feels in his gut that Bill Guerin is going to at some point trade Marco Rossi to try to bring something else into the table. And we heard rumors about this over the offseason that the Wild were trying to find, a 1-for-1 type hockey trade where you could trade Rossi, a young and up-and-coming center, for something you don't have, a player that maybe is also on the young side that you can build around and can add to this core going forward. Easier said than done because, a player like Marco Rossi, who's going to be getting a pretty massive extension, whether it be a bridge deal now or a bigger some sort of a bigger deal after his current deal is done at the end of this season, he is in line for a pretty sizable bump in his pay. And for whatever reason, despite continuing to do all the things that the Minnesota Wild have asked, it does just seem like the Minnesota Wild are still trying to see if what Marco Rossi does is sustainable or not to add into this mix. He is an absolute bulldog. He is a key piece. He's become a key piece of what this team is looking to do. And he is just starting to scratch the surface of what sorts of things he's capable of doing. He's got 15 points in 18 games so far this season. You look at where he's projected for a 68-point season right now with 23 goals. He's having a great year, and he was arguably on maybe the most impactful line in the game against the St. Louis Blues with Marcus Johansson and Ryan Hartman. So he is a key piece of what this Minnesota Wild team is trying to do long term. But this is where Danila Yurov comes into the equation, because Danila Yurov has been pegged and projected as a top 6 piece with top line potential. And that is the kind of thing that would lead to a lot of other pieces being slotted lower in the lineup. And he has played a fair share of center over in the KHL, but he can play wing and is also capable of mixing in at center as well. Looking at his numbers for Metallurge in 21 games so far this season, he has 5 goals and 6 assists. So a little bit of a medium boil as opposed to the absolute rolling boil he was on last year with 49 points in 62 games. But he still is on pace. He still projects to be that type of an impact player. And if he does end up being a center, he would slot Joel Eriksson down to the number 2 spot and Marco Rossi down likely to the 3rd center spot. And me being as greedy as I am, I don't see any reason why you can't have that type of center depth. Look at what the Dallas Stars have built with Rupe Hintz, with everybody up and down that lineup. That kind of center depth is rare. You don't see teams being able to cultivate that type of center depth. And so you would think that the Minnesota Wild would want to have that type of center depth at their disposal. Personally, I think it is far more likely that Yurov starts at the wing to take the place of Marcus Johansson. It seems pretty easy plug and play that you can take Marcus Johansson out of the equation next season and just slot Danila Yurov right into that spot. Let him get acclimated. Let him build up some chemistry. If Matt Boldy isn't the full-time complement to Kirill Kaprizov by next season, he will probably be a really interesting fit with Danila Yurov on the second line. And then when Matt Zuccarello retires, then one of those two steps into that top spot. But I think Yurov has the skill to be that type of top-line impact player that this Wild team has been looking for a long time. I am of the belief that you just keep cultivating the depth and having, this has been pointed out several times on various social media platforms, having good players like that, having multiples, and having to find spots to put them in lineup isn't a bad thing. So if let's say you think Marco Rossi is the better center of the two and Yurov is the better playmaker, there's no reason you can't have both. And it will be something that Bill Guerin has to address. And we're going to talk for an episode coming out later tomorrow afternoon. We're going to talk about, because trade rumors are starting to swirl. So we're going to talk about a team that has been linked to the Minnesota Wild with a couple of players the Wild are apparently involved in to help for this year. But I still think going forward that Marco Rossi can be a big piece of what this Minnesota Wild team is trying to do. And so personally, I would rather keep him, and I think a lot of you are in agreement with me on that. Keep him and let him continue to do his thing and just continue to build pieces to continue to put this team in position to be a legit contender. So great question by Benjo with Danila Yurov. I'd keep them both, but I don't make the decisions. So we'll see how things play out there. We'll continue today's mailbag episode. We're going to talk about Jesper Volstead and when we can expect to see him on the roster. That's coming up as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is also brought to you by Game Time. We continue to push through the winter sports season, which means you have no shortage of opportunities to see your favorite teams in action, whether it be watching the Minnesota Timberwolves at the Target Center, the Minnesota Wild at the XL Energy Center, the Minnesota Vikings at US Bank Stadium, or the Gophers, whether it be the football team, the men's and women's basketball teams, or the hockey team. You've got a lot of options to be able to watch your favorite teams in action, and Game Time is here to make that ticket buying experience as stress-free as possible. Game Time is also offering an exclusive zone deal for the NHL Winter Classic event at Wrigley Field. Go to the Game Time app to purchase tickets and get 10% off bleacher seating and 20 to 25% off on home plate area seats. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. I am delighted to report that we will be bringing you a postcast after the game against the Edmonton Oilers tomorrow night. Internet, I think, is going to work. I think we are in the clear as to being able to handle the full rigors of a stream without having it crash or break down. So we're going to give it a go, and we're going to see what happens after the Wild take on the Edmonton Oilers tomorrow night. It'll be a late one, so join in, and we'll have a good time. Getting back to the mailbag questions here today, and this question coming in from Crush44, when will we see Jesper in net? Well, to be honest, the goaltending situation for the Minnesota Wild has been one of their strengths so far this season. Combined 12-3-3 with a 2.33 goals against average and a .921 save percentage. And I think if you ask Bill Guerin, this is probably the upper level of how he hoped things would play out for the goalie situation this year. We had no idea what to expect for this goalie room this season. You had Filip Gustavsson coming off of a season in which the numbers were up and down. Although, as we've said a lot, the everydayers know that we've discussed Gustafsson's numbers last year as really being held back by 2 bad months. Other than that, he was pretty good. He has gotten to the point where his numbers are as good, if not better, than the numbers that he put together 2 seasons ago when he was near the top of the leaderboard for the Vezina voting. Although not a finalist, he should have been. But 9-3-2 for Filip Gustavsson, a 2.07 goals against average and a .926 save percentage, all within the top 3 in all of those categories. And he continues to be the bell cow. He continues to be the workhorse for the Minnesota Wild in the net. But Marc-Andre Fleury has not, honestly, he has not warranted being pulled out of the lineup. I know we came into the season and wanted to see him step aside to give Jesper Volstead the opportunity to be able to step into the net full time and just take the reins. But Fleury's numbers so far this year, he's started 4 games. So the ratio is very low. He started 4 of the 18 games. And it sounds like he's going to start either tomorrow against Edmonton or Saturday against Calgary. But Filip Gustavsson's been so good that it truly is a number 1 and a backup. And so at this point, what is the best path for Jesper Volstead from a development standpoint? You want him to get starts at the whatever level he's at. But you look at the numbers in Iowa, he's started 9 games. He is 3-5-1 with a 4.26 goals against average and an .864 save percentage. Those numbers are not great. This Minnesota Wild team is doing better than I think anybody expected they would. And as a result, they are in competition. They are competing for a spot in the postseason. But on one side of it, if you're Jesper, like you gotta pick up your numbers a little bit to warrant getting a call up to the NHL level. And so at this point, I think the Wild just want to get him into a situation where he can work through some of the things that have been going on at the AHL level and just continue to build up starts and continue to just try to get some more consistent numbers on the board. Going to his actual game log right now, and if you look at what he has done so far this season, it's very up and down. Like he's had some pretty good starts, but he has also had some in which, things have just not gone his way. And so I think I'll go back to what happened at the beginning of the season with the whole discussion of a 3 goalie rotation. I wish that word had never entered the vocabulary of anybody within either covering or following the team, because I think that led to some expectations that we were going to see Jesper get, 10 to 15 starts so far this season. I think that was the expectation when neither goalie at the NHL level has done anything to warrant being pulled out of the lineup. And so as far as when we see Jesper, that's entirely up to him, and it's entirely up to Marc-Andre Fleury. Look at the starts here. So the first 2 starts of the season were rough for Jesper. He gave up 5 goals, he gave up 7. Then he went on a stretch of 4 straight in which he gave up 3 or fewer, but then he gave up 5 goals on the 7th, 3 goals against Texas on the 15th, and he started the next night and gave up 8 goals. So a back-to-back starting both games and giving up 11 in those 2 games, that's going to really buoy your numbers. But it looks like he's starting to get things figured out a little bit, with the exception of 2 out of his last 3 starts. But I like what John Hines said when talking about Jesper and just saying, look, I don't care as much about the results this season as much as how do you bounce back from adversity. That's been a big key for the John Hines tenures. How do you bounce back from adversity? What are you going to do to put yourself in position to make your next start? And for Jesper, he knows he's going to be at the NHL level next season because he signed a one-way contract that goes into effect next season. So I am just going to view the Jesper numbers as a whole. I'm not super worried about where he's at in his process, because he has up to this point had some pretty darn good success, and that's just not how it's going to work at the NHL level. Every start is not going to go according to plan. You're going to have nights where the team in front of you is just absent. You're going to have nights where there are some goals that you'd like to have back. Just part of the experience is how do you handle it? How do you bounce back? And At this point, until either Marc-Andre Fleury or Filip Gustavsson gets hurt or falters, that's going to be your goalie combo for the foreseeable future, with Filip Gustavsson taking a lion's share of those starts. And I mean, it's just pretty simple math, which is funny for those on YouTube who can see me clearly looking at my phone to do this via calculator. But 14 out of 18 starts is 77% of the starts so far. And if you take 82 games times 77%, that's 63 games for Filip Gustavsson that he could potentially start this year as the number one goalie. So he's the number one. Marc-Andre Fleury is clearly the backup. And we'll reevaluate where Jesper is at maybe halfway through the season and see if he has started to kind of get things back on track and back to putting up those big numbers that we've seen from him over the last couple of seasons. We will finish our mailbag episode by taking a look at a piece of the puzzle for the Wild after this season is up, because guess what? The money is finally coming back into the Minnesota Wild pocketbooks. Or is it? We'll talk about that as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. You could, for instance, take Justin Jefferson to go over his 87.5 expected yards and Kirill Kaprizov to go over 1.5 points on the road. And you'd be supporting two of your favorite Minnesota sports teams. And you would be a winner if both of those hit on Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Home stretch of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. We thank you also for continuing with us here as we move through the rest of the Minnesota Wild season. We'll do more of these mailbags as we move on through the next few weeks. So we'll put those in the community tab. If you are looking to get your questions answered, drop them in a comment to those community posts, and we'll get them answered here on the show. And appreciate all of the comments we got, all the questions. Circled in on 3 of them here today, but don't worry, all the rest will be answered here within the next week. So let's finish with Dr. Stevens 21. Big ideas for when we get out of cap hell, and also enticing Kirill Kaprizov to stay. The Zach Parise and Ryan Suter cap hits drop to just a combined $1.4 million starting next year, so I don't have to ever talk about the buyouts ever again, because it will truly just be the buyouts at that point. $833,333 for the next 3 seasons after the current chunk of $14.747 million. So what do you do with it? Well, some of that money has been allocated to a few extensions with Brock Faber, with Matt Zuccarello, with Marcus Foligno, with Ryan Hartman, Yakov Trenin, Freddie Gaudreau, all locked in past this season. You've also got Jake Middleton. You got Zach Bogosian signed to a $1.25 million deal after this season as part of a 2-year extension that he signed. But we were talking about this on the national show yesterday. There is expected to be a sizable bump in the salary cap that is coming here soon, because the players have paid back the money that they borrowed from the owners, and we're well past the COVID bubble. Money's starting to really trickle in a nice fashion, and you could see a bump to as high as $97 million. And so a lot of the money that would have been freed up by Zach Parise and Ryan Suter's cap hits has gone to extensions and will go to further extensions, because there are other players that are going to need extensions. Murat Huznadinov is in the final year of his ELC. Marco Rossi is in the final year of his ELC. Jakub Lauko is in the final year of his deal. He will be a restricted free agent after this season is done. You've got unrestricted free agents in Marcus Johansson and John Merrill. And so there will be some money that gets put into those deals. There will be some more money coming off the books. Marc-Andre Fleury, obviously, that's $2.5 million that will be coming off the books after this season. And so if that salary cap jump is as big as it's expected to be, that's where you got some money to play around with a few things. And we talked about this before the season started, when it was released that Craig Leopold asked Bill Guerin to put together a 5-year plan to end in a Stanley Cup championship, and the Wild being in, I think they're in year 2. Craig Leopold wants a big fish in the offseason. And there's not going to be a ton of money for the Minnesota Wild to spend. I think the number that's been thrown out has been somewhere around $10 million to go get a really big impact type player to throw into the mix in the top 6. I'll throw every cent that I own, if he gets to free agency, on the Minnesota Wild making a big push for Brock Boeser. He is in the final year of his deal with the Vancouver Canucks. He is, there's not a ton of money for Vancouver that is going to be available for them to do a bunch of things, because you look at their books and Boeser comes off. He was making $6.65 million. You've got Elias Pettersson locked in. You've got JT Miller locked in. Jake DeBrusk is locked in for 5.5. Dakota Joshua's locked in for 3.25. You might, depending on what happens with Thatcher Demko, you might have to make a push to get a bigger type goalie to fill that spot. And it's not going to shock me in the slightest if Vancouver makes a really concerted effort to try to retain Brock Boeser. But Brock Boeser is a Minnesotan through and through. And so at some point, is he going to want to come back here, to come to Minnesota, and get a chance to try to get it done with this Minnesota Wild team? That is, I think, where the money's going to go. And look, he's going to be 28 heading into free agency. So he's still on the right side of 30. He would be a bona fide top 6 player. You would be looking at a situation where you could put him on the top line with Kirill Kaprizov, or you could put him on the second line, depending on what happens with Matt Boldy, with Danila Yurov. You could go from, in one offseason, you could go to a top 6 that consists of, in whatever order you want, Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Brock Boeser, Matt Boldy, Marco Rossi, and Matt Zuccarello. That's not bad at all. That would be a contender type top 6 that could do some real damage in not only the Central Division, but the Western Conference and the NHL as well. The Wild are going to have to pony up, though. They're going to have to make it worth Besser's while to come here. So if you have $10, $11 million to play with under normal circumstances, and all of a sudden the salary cap goes up $4 or $5 million more than that, then you can. Your list of needs is going to be far smaller if the prospects that you have in the system pan out. Marcus Johansson's spot needs to be filled. Hey, we've got Danila Yurov. Come on down. John Merrill's spot needs to be filled. Hey, guess what? Damon Hunt is ready to go. Marc-Andre Fleury, retiring. Oh, Jesper Volstead. We've got him in the pipeline ready to go. So you're filling all of those spots with ELC contracts. And you've got Zeev Buium as well. Declan Chisholm is a Group 6 unrestricted free agent. So he could either be a unrestricted or a restricted free agent, depending on how the rest of the season goes. But you got Zeev Buium to throw in the mix as well. Another ELC deal. So you are talking about 1, 2, 3, and Jesper's is not an ELC. It's $2.2 million, but still, that's a $300K savings from Marc-Andre Fleury to Jesper Volstead. So you are filling 1, 2, 3 roster spots at least with minimum deals. So you can afford to go big to try to lock in somebody like Brock Boeser to come here and to help further solidify that top 6. So going back to the original question is ideas for how to get out of cap hell. Make a big splash. And that's why I continue to bang the table for something to be done this season to help further that and help lead you into next year and beyond. It's a Western Conference that features a couple of teams that are on the top of the list right now. The Wild battled Winnipeg to overtime. There are like 4 teams that have done that so far this season. That's it. They battled the Dallas Stars to a tight 2-1 loss without Matt Zuccarello in the top 6 and trying to just figure out the lines on the fly. And I know you're not going to have ideal conditions anytime you play an opponent, but the games against these teams that are the top end contenders have been far closer this year, which leads you to believe that the Wild are going to start flipping some of them in their favor. And if they do, then that means that they are a legitimate team in the mix this season, which is exactly why it makes a lot of sense to go do something to help you this year. Maybe a player that can come in the rest of this year and then they're off the books. But just go for it. Why not? The future is always going to be there. And these players take time to develop. Not everybody hops in like Matt Boldy did. Not everybody hops in like Brock Faber did. Sometimes you got a situation like Marco Rossi where it takes a couple of tries to really get everything ready. And that's why we see players so gradually ushered into NHL life, is to try to help make that transition a little easier. So we'll see what happens, but if this Wild team continues to win, then it may be time to go get something done. And we're going to talk, as I mentioned, on an episode coming out tomorrow afternoon about a team that has already been linked to the Minnesota Wild from the trade perspective, the Philadelphia Flyers. We'll tell you who and if it makes sense on tomorrow's episode. We've also got a crossover with Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers to preview tomorrow night's game. We'll talk about some of the comparisons between Connor McDavid and Kirill Kaprizov. And honestly, we just kind of marveled at him a little bit, which, to be fair, it's hard not to. So we'll talk about that on tomorrow's episode. And then we'll talk about some trade wins as well as John Hines' post-game comments. That's all coming up for you tomorrow. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, as always, to another episode of Locked On Wild. Appreciate everybody's patience as I kind of get adjusted to my new routine. And we'll just continue to keep you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.